broke, unemployed writer scribbled 9 words on a notepad and forgot about them for years. A good guy does something bad to save his family. Every major network turned it down. One executive left the script buried on his desk for weeks before finally reading it. That forgotten note eventually produced the highest-rated episode of television ever recorded, and this is how it happened. Section 1. A 9-word note and a desperate phone call. Long before Walter White ever mixed a single chemical, before Albuquerque became the backdrop for one of the darkest stories television had ever told, there was just a man in his 30s, out of work, talking to a friend on the phone, wondering what came next. The story of Breaking Bad does not begin with a network meeting or a polished pitch document. It begins with 2 writers who had run out of options. Vince Gilligan had spent years writing for The X-Files, a show about government conspiracies and the unexplained, working alongside a rotating cast of talented people who would go on to shape television for decades. When that series ended in the early 2000s, Gilligan found himself in a strange kind of professional limbo. He was skilled, respected within the industry, and completely without steady work. Around the same time, a friend of his named Thomas Schnauz, who had also written for The X-Files, was in a similar position. Neither of them had steady income. Both were trying to figure out where their careers were headed next. It was during one of these phone calls, the kind 2 worried friends have when neither wants to say out loud how nervous they are about money, that the seed of the idea appeared. Gilligan has told this story many times over the years, and the details shift slightly, depending on which interview someone finds, but the shape of it stays the same. 2 unemployed television writers, half joking about their situation, wondering aloud what a person might do if they had no other way to make ends meet. Somewhere in that conversation, the image of a father turning to crime out of desperation took hold in Gilligan's mind. Years later, Gilligan would find an old notepad in his office, one he had completely forgotten about. On it was the very first version of the idea, written down before he had a title, before he had a name for his protagonist, before he had any sense of what the show would eventually become. The note read simply that a good guy does something bad in order to save his family. 9 words. That was the entire architecture of what would eventually grow into 62 episodes of television, 5 seasons, and a story that critics would later call one of the greatest ever told on the small screen. It is worth sitting with how small that beginning was. There was no elaborate outline. There was no fully formed character sketch. Just an idea, distilled down to its emotional core. The kind of premise that could fit on an index card. What Gilligan understood, even in that early moment, was that the engine of the story needed to be a transformation. Not a man who was secretly bad all along and finally got the chance to show it, but a man who started out decent, who started out sympathetic, and who slowly, believably, became someone else entirely. To describe that transformation to people in the entertainment industry, Gilligan needed a shorthand, something that would let executives instantly picture the emotional distance the story intended to travel. He settled on a comparison that would follow him for the rest of his career. He described the show as taking Mr. Chips and turning him into Scarface. For those unfamiliar with the reference, Mr. Chips comes from a beloved English novella about a kind, gentle schoolteacher, a man so mild and so devoted to his students that his name became synonymous with old-fashioned decency. Scarface, on the other hand, is the ruthless, cocaine-fueled gangster played by Al Pacino in the 1980s film of the same name, a man whose hunger for power eventually consumes everyone around him. Putting those 2 men in the same sentence was, in a sense, the entire pitch. A mild-mannered high school teacher, a terrifying criminal kingpin. Gilligan's promise to any network willing to listen was that his show would take an audience on the journey between those 2 extremes, slowly, deliberately, and without ever cheating the transformation. Walter White would not simply decide to become a monster one day. He would earn that title, episode by episode, choice by choice, until there was no way back. Gilligan has spoken about the personal moment that helped shape the character further. He was approaching his 40th birthday around the time the idea came to him, and he has admitted, with some humor, that he suspects part of the concept grew out of something close to a midlife crisis of his own. Not that Gilligan himself considered cooking methamphetamine, but the underlying anxiety, the sense of time running out, the question of what a person has actually accomplished with the years given to them. All of that fed into the character, who would become Walter White. In interviews, Gilligan described Walt, at least in the earliest seasons, as a man suffering from perhaps the worst midlife crisis in television history. A man whose diagnosis with cancer becomes less a death sentence and more a strange, terrible kind of permission. Permission to stop being careful, permission to stop being invisible. With the concept in place, Gilligan set about writing a pilot script and shaping the world these characters would inhabit. He decided early that the story would center on a high school chemistry teacher, a profession that gave Walt both the technical skill needed to cook a superior product and the tragic irony of someone brilliant and underappreciated, teaching teenagers who barely paid attention to him. The cancer diagnosis gave the story its ticking clock, its justification, at least in Walt's own mind, for turning to crime. He would tell himself, and try to tell his family, that everything he did was for them, to leave behind enough money that they would never struggle after he was gone. Once the pilot script existed, the far harder part of the process began. Gilligan needed to sell the idea to networks, and the response he got was, for a long stretch of time, almost uniformly discouraging. It is easy now, with the benefit of hindsight, to forget just how radical the premise sounded in the mid-2000s. A show about a man cooking crystal meth was not an easy sell to broadcast executives worried about advertisers and family-friendly programming blocks. Gilligan has said that many networks were never even approached, because he and his team assumed correctly that the major broadcast networks would never touch a project built around drug manufacturing. Cable networks seemed like the more logical home, and Gilligan pursued several of them without success. He pitched the show to Showtime, which passed largely because the network was already airing a different series about a suburban parent turned drug dealer, the marijuana-focused comedy drama Weeds. The concern was that audiences and executives would see the two shows as too similar, even though the tone and subject matter were quite different underneath the surface similarity. Gilligan has since joked that had he been more familiar with Weeds before writing his own pilot, he might never have moved forward with Breaking Bad at all, simply out of a wish to avoid the comparison. He also brought the project to HBO, a network famous for taking creative risks on prestige dramas. That meeting did not go well. Gilligan has described it in interviews as one of the worst pitch meetings of his career, remembering the atmosphere in the room as a kind of toxic disinterest radiating off the executives across the table. It is a strange thing to imagine now, given how closely Breaking Bad would eventually be compared to HBO's own landmark dramas. But at the time, the network simply was not interested in a story about a meth dealer. TNT came close to being a home for the show, and the meeting there left a somewhat better impression, even though it too ended in rejection. According to Gilligan, the executives at TNT told him plainly that they loved the material, but that buying it would likely cost them their jobs, given the network's programming direction at that point in time. It was, in its own way, one of the more encouraging rejections he received. A no that still validated the strength of the writing, even while closing the door. FX also entered the picture for a period. The network was interested enough to begin serious discussions about developing the pilot, and for a while, it looked as though Breaking Bad might find its home there. but FX was juggling several other projects with similar anti-hero premises at the time, including a drama called Dirt, starring Courtney Cox, and there was only room in the schedule for one new show with that kind of tone. FX chose Dirt. That series ran for 2 brief seasons before being cancelled. A footnote that later became almost darkly funny once Breaking Bad went on to become one of the most celebrated shows in television history. By this point, Gilligan had been turned down by nearly every plausible cable home for the project. It would have been reasonable for him to shelve the idea and move on to something else. Instead, the search continued, eventually leading to AMC, a network that in the mid-2000s was still primarily known for showing classic films rather than producing original scripted programming. AMC was in the process of trying to change that reputation, and the network's leadership was looking for a companion series to sit alongside a new drama they had recently commissioned about advertising executives in 1960s New York. That show would become Mad Men. Getting the script in front of the right person at AMC took time and persistence. Gilligan's representatives worked to arrange a meeting with the network's director of original programming, and once that meeting happened, the script itself still had to make its way up the chain of command. According to accounts from people involved at the time, the executive who first read Breaking Bad kept encouraging his superior to give it a look, and the script reportedly sat on that superior's desk for weeks before he finally picked it up. When he did read it, he responded to the same core idea that had driven Gilligan from the very beginning: the journey from a milquetoast, unassuming man into something far darker and more dangerous. AMC, hoping to build a reputation as a network willing to take chances other broadcasters would not, decided to move forward. It is worth pausing here to consider what a strange, unlikely path this was. A show now regarded by many critics and viewers as one of the finest pieces of television ever produced, very nearly did not exist at all. It survived a string of rejections that would have discouraged most writers from continuing. It survived being pitched to executives who, by their own accounts, felt nothing but indifference toward it. It found a home not because a network was searching for exactly this kind of story, but because one executive happened to be persistent enough to keep pushing a script that had been gathering dust, and because another executive happened to be looking for something bold enough to sit next to Mad Men on a growing network schedule. Once AMC committed to the project, another crucial piece of the puzzle needed to fall into place, and that was the casting of Walter White himself. Gilligan already had someone specific in mind, an actor he had worked with years earlier during his time on The X-Files. That actor had appeared in a single episode, playing a deeply unpleasant, frightened man suffering from a strange and painful affliction, and something about the way he balanced menace and vulnerability had stuck with Gilligan ever since. That casting decision, and the unusual path it took to actually happen, would shape the entire future of the show in ways nobody could have predicted at the time. The road from a 9-word note on a forgotten notepad to a greenlit pilot episode had taken years, countless rejections, and no small amount of stubbornness on Gilligan's part. But by the time AMC agreed to move forward, the foundation of the story was already remarkably solid. A good man, a terrible diagnosis, a slow, deliberate slide toward becoming someone unrecognizable. All that remained now was finding the right actor to carry that transformation and convincing a skeptical industry that he was the right choice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A forgotten notepad and a string of rejections nearly kept this story from ever reaching a screen. Next, the casting decision that almost didn't happen, and the unlikely actor who convinced everyone he was the only man who could play Walter White. Section 2. The goofy sitcom dad nobody wanted for the part. By the time AMC agreed to move forward with Breaking Bad, Vince Gilligan already had a very specific actor in mind for the role of Walter White, and almost nobody around him agreed with the choice. That actor was Bryan Cranston, a performer who, at that point in his career, was best known to television audiences as the goofy, excitable father on a Fox family sitcom. Convincing a network to trust that man with the emotional weight of a story built on menace, tragedy, and slow moral collapse would prove to be one of the more difficult battles in the show's early history. And it is worth slowing down here, because the casting of Walter White is one of those decisions that, in hindsight, feels inevitable, when in reality, it very nearly went a completely different way. Gilligan's history with Cranston stretched back to his years writing for The X-Files. During the 6th season of that show, Gilligan wrote an episode called Drive, in which Cranston played a terrified, furious man suffering from a bizarre affliction that forced him to keep moving west at all times or risk a violent death. The character was, on paper, deeply unlikable. He was angry, bigoted, and cruel to the people around him for much of his screen time. There was very little in the writing itself that suggested the audience should feel anything but relief when he was gone. Yet by the episode's conclusion, the story needed something more complicated from its audience. It needed viewers to feel something close to sympathy for him as he met his fate, despite everything they had just watched him say and do. Gilligan has said that the show needed the audience to feel sorry for this villain when he died, and that Cranston was the only actor who auditioned who managed to pull that off convincingly. Other actors who read for the part, according to Gilligan, played the character as simply hateful, giving the writers nothing to work with beyond contempt. Cranston found something else in the material, some thread of exhaustion and fear underneath the cruelty, and he let that thread show through just enough that the character's death landed as tragedy rather than punishment. That single performance planted itself firmly in Gilligan's memory, and it became the reference point he returned to years later when trying to imagine who could play a character required to be both frightening and, at times, quietly tragic. It is a small irony worth noting that Gilligan's entire theory of Walter White as a performance, a man audiences would need to simultaneously fear and mourn, had already been proven correct by this same actor years earlier, on an entirely different show, in a role that had nothing to do with chemistry or crime. When Breaking Bad finally moved into production, Gilligan pushed hard for Cranston, but the response from network executives at AMC was hesitant at best. The issue was not Cranston's talent. Nobody doubted that. The issue was image, and image, in television, can be a stubborn thing to shake. For 6 years, television audiences had come to know Cranston as Hal, the endearingly ridiculous patriarch of Malcolm in the Middle, a show that leaned heavily on his gift for physical comedy and cartoonish overreaction. Hal was a man who might strip down to his underwear and dance through the house, who threw himself into absurd family schemes with childlike enthusiasm, who existed almost entirely in a register of comic chaos. He cried easily, panicked easily, and treated the smallest domestic inconveniences as existential crises, asking audiences and executives to picture that same actor as a quietly seething, morally compromised drug manufacturer felt to many people at the network like an enormous risk, the kind of casting decision that could undermine the seriousness of the entire project before a single episode aired. There is an interesting layer of backstory to how Cranston even ended up playing Hal in the first place, one that later became a strange little footnote once Breaking Bad made him famous for something entirely different. According to the sitcom's creator, Linwood Boomer, the character of Hal was not originally written with much depth or comic possibility. He was, in Boomer's own words, not written correctly on the page, mostly functioning as a plot device rather than a fully realized person. The scripts gave him little to actually do, beyond reacting to the chaos generated by his children. It was Cranston's audition that changed everything. And even though the audition scene gave him almost nothing to work with, requiring him mostly to sit and listen, while other actors performed the bulk of the dialogue, Cranston filled the silence with such a vivid inner life that Boomer said he literally fell off his chair laughing while watching. Cranston made it look as though Hal's mind was constantly racing behind his blank expression, as though he were quietly building something elaborate inside his head, while appearing to do nothing at all. That instinct for interior life, hiding behind a mundane exterior, would end up being exactly the skill Walter White required years later, though almost nobody watching Malcolm in the Middle at the time would have guessed it. Boomer has since said that Cranston effectively rewrote the character through performance alone, taking a role meant to be a background device and turning it into one of the most memorable comic fathers of its era. For a while, Cranston's association with that broad comedic role nearly cost him the part of Walter White entirely. Executives at AMC struggled to see past 6 years of goofy dad energy, and there were serious conversations about casting someone else, someone whose recent work leaned closer to drama, someone audiences had never watched fall over furniture for a laugh. Gilligan has said plainly that had Malcolm in the Middle been renewed for an 8th season, Cranston would not have been available at all, and someone else entirely would have played Walter White. The timing worked out by coincidence rather than design. Malcolm in the Middle wrapped its run after 7 seasons, freeing Cranston up during the very summer that Gilligan's Breaking Bad script found its way into his hands. Had the sitcom's ratings held on for just one more year, one of the defining performances in television history might never have existed in the form fans now recognize. Cranston has spoken about first reading that script and immediately recognizing what kind of story it was trying to tell. He gave Gilligan credit for having already built such a clear blueprint of the character before Cranston ever got involved, which allowed him to step into a role that already had a strong foundation, rather than one he needed to invent from nothing. Cranston also brought something personal into his interpretation of Walt, drawing on memories of his own father, a man who had once carried real ambition but never managed to fully realize it, and who Cranston has described as walking with a kind of slumped posture, as though the weight of unmet expectations sat physically on his shoulders. That image, a man crushed slowly by disappointment rather than dramatic tragedy, became part of how Cranston physically carried Walter White in the earliest episodes, long before the character had done anything resembling a crime. Still, convincing the people financing the show took more than one good script and one actor's enthusiasm. Gilligan had to advocate strongly on Cranston's behalf, leaning on that memory of the X-Files performance as proof that this was an actor capable of making an audience feel two conflicting emotions toward the same character at once: fear and sympathy, disgust and understanding. Eventually, that argument won out, and Cranston was cast, though the doubts around the decision did not fully disappear until episodes actually began airing and critics started singling out his performance for praise. While Cranston's casting battle centered on overcoming a comedic reputation, the search for the actor to play Walter White's future partner in crime, Jesse Pinkman, unfolded along a very different path, one shaped almost entirely by a twist of scheduling and a piece of good fortune that nobody could have planned for. Aaron Paul auditioned for the role of Jesse without any illusions about how the character was originally intended to function within the larger story. Jesse, in the earliest version of the Season 1 arc, was never meant to be a long-term presence at all. He existed as a narrative device, the low-level dealer who introduces Walt to the drug trade and then exits the story in dramatic fashion, dying in a botched deal that would send Walt spiraling into a Season 2 arc built around grief and revenge. In the original pilot script, the character did not even carry the name Jesse Pinkman, appearing instead under a different name entirely, before Gilligan settled on the one audiences would come to know. Paul has told the story of learning about this plan more than once in interviews over the years, and the details he shares paint a vivid picture of just how close Jesse came to disappearing from the show entirely. According to Paul, he did not find out about the original plan until near the end of the first season, when Gilligan pulled him aside during a lunch break on set. Gilligan was sitting with the writers at the time, and he called Paul over to tell him something important. What followed was Gilligan explaining, with evident relief, that the original arc for the season had called for Jesse to die, with Walt then being pushed by grief and guilt into pursuing revenge during the second season. But something had changed that plan almost as soon as filming began. That something was the chemistry between Paul and Cranston, visible from the earliest days of shooting the pilot. Gilligan has said that by the second episode of the first season, it had become obvious to him and to everyone in the writer's room that killing off Jesse would be an enormous mistake. The dynamic between the two actors carried a kind of electricity that the scripts alone had not necessarily predicted. A push and pull between a domineering, increasingly manipulative teacher and a resentful, wounded, surprisingly tender former student. Gilligan later admitted that at the time he made the decision to keep Jesse alive, he did not yet understand exactly how important the character would eventually become to the larger story. Only that removing him now felt like it would be throwing away something valuable. He has said he did not yet grasp how Jesse would eventually function, almost as the show's conscience, the character whose remaining decency threw Walt's growing cruelty into sharper relief with each passing season. The timing of this decision intersected with an entirely separate piece of real-world disruption. The writers' strike of 2007 and 2008 forced the first season of Breaking Bad to be cut short, reduced from a planned run of 9 episodes down to 7. Jesse's scripted death had originally been slated for episode 9, an episode that, because of the strike, was never written or produced at all. It would be easy to assume, given that timing, that the strike itself is what saved the character. But Gilligan has been clear in interviews that the decision to keep Jesse alive had already been made well before the strike forced any scheduling changes. The strike simply meant that the death scene, which had already been abandoned creatively, never had the chance to exist on paper in the first place. It is a strange kind of double insurance, a character saved twice over by two entirely separate forces, one artistic and one industrial, arriving almost simultaneously. Paul's reaction to hearing all of this, delivered secondhand years later alongside Cranston during various interviews and podcast appearances, has often carried a note of disbelief mixed with dark humor. Cranston, for his part, has jokingly said more than once that he almost wishes the original plan had gone through, a comment clearly meant in jest, given how much both actors clearly cherish the bond between Walt and Jesse that defined so much of the show's most memorable material. But underneath the joke sits a genuinely strange piece of television history, one of the most acclaimed and awarded performances in the medium. A character who would go on to anchor a feature-length sequel film years after the show ended, very nearly never made it past the 9th episode of the first season. There is a small piece of trivia buried within this history that adds another layer of coincidence. Before Aaron Paul was cast as Jesse, he had actually auditioned years earlier for a minor role on Malcolm in the Middle, the very show that had given Cranston his earlier fame. Paul auditioned for the part of Francis, the eldest son in the family, a role that ultimately went to a different actor. Paul has spoken about how strange it felt years later to learn he would be working directly opposite Cranston on Breaking Bad, joking that he was confused when he first heard that the goofy father from Malcolm in the Middle had been cast as the show's lead, since he had been such a fan of that character growing up, and could not initially picture him in something so dark. Had the earlier audition gone differently, the entire trajectory of both actors' careers might have unfolded in an entirely different order. with the two men perhaps never crossing paths at all, in the way that ultimately defined both of their careers. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a show whose two central performances, the ones most responsible for its eventual reputation as one of television's finest achievements, were both shaped by decisions that could easily have gone another way. Cranston nearly lost the role of Walter White because network executives could not separate him from 6 years of broad comedy. Jesse Pinkman nearly vanished from the story entirely after a single season, killed off as a plot device before the writers fully understood what they had in front of them. Both outcomes were reversed, not through careful long-term planning, but through a combination of persistence, coincidence, and the simple, undeniable evidence of what happened once the cameras started rolling and two actors were given room to work together in the same scene. Once the cast was locked into place, the show still needed to prove itself to an audience that had never heard of a chemistry teacher turned drug manufacturer, airing on a network that had never produced an original drama series before. The pilot episode, when it finally aired in January of 2008, carried the full weight of that uncertainty. It needed to introduce Walter White's ordinary, unremarkable life, with enough patience that his eventual transformation would feel earned, while also hooking an audience quickly enough that they would return the following week, a difficult balance for any new drama trying to establish itself on a network still building its original programming reputation from nothing. Gilligan has spoken about the specific structural choice he made to solve this problem, opening the story with a flash forward rather than a straightforward chronological beginning, and that decision would end up shaping the visual and narrative identity of the entire series that followed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two actors almost never got the chance to play these roles at all, saved only by chemistry nobody had fully anticipated. Next, the pilot episode itself, and the structural trick Gilligan used to hook an audience before they even understood what kind of story they were watching. Section 3. The pilot that had to hook sleepy viewers before they knew what they were watching. Every television pilot carries an unusual burden. It has to introduce a world, establish characters an audience has never met, and somehow convince that audience to come back next week, all within about an hour of screen time. For most shows, that burden is manageable because the premise itself does some of the work. A hospital drama promises medical crises. A police procedural promises crime and resolution. Breaking Bad faced a stranger problem. Its entire premise depended on an audience watching a mild, unremarkable man for a long stretch of time before anything resembling excitement happened. And Vince Gilligan understood early on that this posed a serious structural risk. Gilligan has been candid in interviews about the thinking behind this problem. He knew that if he introduced Walter White exactly as the character needed to be introduced, as a bland, quiet, slightly pathetic high school chemistry teacher, he would be asking viewers to sit through what he called at least 2 acts of a fairly uneventful, milquetoast kind of character before the story earned any right to their attention. In television, where a viewer can change the channel within seconds of losing interest, that kind of patience is not something a new show can simply assume it has earned. Gilligan needed a reason for people to keep watching, even during the stretches where Walt was still just an ordinary man. Before any drugs, before any chemistry set turned into a meth lab, before any of the transformation the entire series was built around had actually begun. His solution was to open the pilot with a flash forward, a technique that would go on to become one of the show's defining visual and structural signatures. Rather than starting with Walt waking up on an ordinary morning, teaching an unimpressed classroom of teenagers, coming home to a modest house and a family who barely notices him, Gilligan chose to begin somewhere else entirely. The pilot opens with a pair of khaki pants falling through the air, landing on a desert road, followed by the sight of a man in his underwear and a gas mask driving an RV erratically through the New Mexico desert, two unconscious bodies sliding around in the back. He pulls over, grabs a gun, records a confession for his family on a video camera with hands that will not stop shaking, and then, hearing sirens approaching, prepares to face them not as a man surrendering, but as a man ready to go out fighting. It is a startling, disorienting opening, one that gives no context at all for who this man is or how he got there. And that, according to Gilligan, was exactly the point. He described the reasoning behind this choice in fairly simple, practical terms, calling it a meat and potatoes schematic decision rather than some grand artistic statement. He needed to give the audience a reason to keep watching through the slower stretches that were coming, and dropping them into a moment of chaos and danger before rewinding the clock accomplished that. Once the story pulls back to reveal that this same man in his underwear in the desert is actually a soft-spoken high school teacher living an entirely unremarkable life just days earlier, the audience is left with a question that carries them through the entire episode and beyond. How does a man like this end up in a situation like that? The flash-forward functions less like a spoiler and more like a promise, a guarantee to the viewer that patience will be rewarded, that the quiet opening scenes of Walt teaching a bored classroom about chemical properties are building towards something. This structural choice reveals something important about how Gilligan thought about storytelling more broadly, a philosophy that would define the show for years afterward. He was, by his own account, thinking like a writer solving a very specific problem, rather than someone chasing shock value for its own sake. The flash-forward was not there to titillate or confuse audiences purely for the sake of mystery. It was there to solve a pacing problem created by the show's own premise. The fact that a genuine transformation from good to bad requires time, requires the audience to actually witness the ordinary version of the character before the extraordinary version can mean anything at all. Skip past that ordinary version too quickly, and the transformation loses its power. Take too long establishing it without any forward momentum, and the audience leaves before the transformation even begins. The flash forward was Gilligan's answer to that tension, a way of having both patience and urgency inside the same episode. Once the pilot rewinds to introduce Walt's actual daily life, the show settles into a rhythm that would become recognizable across its entire run, a rhythm built on quiet humiliations accumulating one after another. Walt teaches high school chemistry to a room full of students who are, at best, indifferent to him. He works a second job at a car wash to help make ends meet, a job that requires him, at one particularly telling moment, to personally wax the car belonging to one of his own students, who watches with a mixture of amusement and pity as his teacher scrubs at the hood. At home, Walt shares an awkward, deflated birthday dinner with his family, where the television plays quietly in the background, and his brother-in-law Hank, a boisterous DEA agent, dominates the conversation with stories from his job, casually overshadowing Walt without any apparent malice, simply because that is the natural order of things between them. Walt's wife Skylar is pregnant, distracted, running a household that seems to function despite him rather than because of him. There is no cruelty being inflicted on Walt in these early scenes. There is only the slow, grinding weight of being overlooked, of being a smart, capable man who has somehow ended up invisible in his own life. Then comes the diagnosis. Walt collapses at the car wash, is taken to the hospital, and learns that he has inoperable lung cancer, with a prognosis that gives him perhaps a year or two left to live, if he is fortunate. It is in the aftermath of this diagnosis that Walt makes the decision that sets the entire series in motion. He accompanies Hank on what he initially frames as harmless curiosity, joining a DEA ride-along to see a drug bust in action, and in the process, spots a former student, Jesse Pinkman, fleeing across a rooftop from the scene of the crime. That chance encounter becomes the doorway into the story's central partnership. Walt tracks Jesse down, reveals that he knows about his involvement in the local drug trade, and proposes an arrangement. Walt will use his chemistry expertise to cook a purer, more potent form of methamphetamine than anything currently available, and Jesse, with his existing connections in the drug world, will handle the distribution. The reasoning Walt gives for this decision, both to Jesse and to himself, centers entirely on his family. He tells himself, and later insists to characters throughout the show, that everything he is doing exists purely to provide for his wife, his teenage son, who has cerebral palsy, and the child Skylar is carrying. He calculates, in an early scene that has since become one of the show's most quoted moments, the exact amount of money he believes his family will need to survive without him, arriving at a specific figure that becomes an early goal, a finish line he tells himself he will stop at once he reaches it. It is worth noting, looking back at this moment with the full run of the series in mind, just how sincerely Walt seems to believe this reasoning at the start. The show does not present him as lying to himself in some obvious, winking way in these early episodes. He genuinely appears to believe that this will be a temporary, contained solution to a temporary, contained problem. The tragedy of the character, one that unfolds gradually across the following seasons, is watching that sincere belief slowly curdle into something closer to rationalization, and then into something that barely resembles an excuse at all. One especially significant moment from these early episodes deserves particular attention, because it lays bare the emotional core the entire series would return to, again and again. Before Walt fully commits to cooking meth, he is offered a legitimate way out of his financial troubles. Two former colleagues from his past, Elliot and Gretchen, who Walt had once worked alongside during his early career in chemistry research, offer to cover his medical expenses entirely, no strings attached, simply as an act of old friendship and generosity. It would be, by any practical measure, the easiest possible solution to Walt's problem. He turns it down. His stated reason is pride, an unwillingness to accept charity from people who he believes underestimated him. People connected to a company that Walt helped build in its early days, before circumstances, described only vaguely in that first season, led to him leaving, with nothing, while his former partners went on to enormous wealth and success. The decision to refuse that help is, in many ways, the true origin point of everything that follows. It is not the cancer that damns Walter White. It is not even the choice to start cooking meth. It is this moment, refusing an easy, honorable solution, because his ego cannot tolerate the idea of being rescued, especially not by people he feels wronged him decades earlier. Everything that happens afterward, all the destruction that follows across the next 4 seasons, traces back to this single refusal. The early episodes of the first season also began establishing the show's distinctive visual language, one that would set it apart from most television dramas airing at the time. The production made heavy use of the New Mexico landscape itself, filming extensively around Albuquerque and the surrounding desert, using wide, sweeping shots of empty terrain to create a sense of isolation and exposure around the characters. Even mundane scenes, conversations happening in kitchens or classrooms, were shot with an attention to composition and color that felt closer to feature filmmaking than typical network television at the time. This visual ambition would only grow more pronounced as the seasons progressed, and the show's budget and reputation increased. But the seeds of that approach are visible even in these earliest, more modest episodes, when the show was still an unproven commodity, airing on a network nobody yet associated with prestige drama. Despite the strength of the writing and the visual craft on display, Breaking Bad did not arrive as an instant sensation. When the pilot aired in January of 2008, the show drew a little over 1 million viewers, a respectable, but unremarkable number for a new cable drama. Nowhere close to the kind of audience that would eventually make the show a cultural phenomenon. The timing of that debut was also complicated by the ongoing writers' strike, which had already disrupted television production across the industry and forced Gilligan to cut the planned first season down from 9 episodes to 7. That reduction meant several storylines originally planned for the season, including the death of Jesse Pinkman, discussed in the previous section, never made it to screen in their intended form. The shortened season gave the show's first year a somewhat compressed, urgent feeling, one that in hindsight some critics and fans have suggested actually benefited the story, forcing an economy of storytelling that kept the early episodes tight and focused rather than allowing them to meander. Critical response to the first season was largely positive from the beginning, even as mainstream audience numbers remained modest. Reviewers responded strongly to Cranston's performance in particular, recognizing early on that he was doing something unusual with the role, finding moments of dark comedy and genuine pathos within a character who, on paper, could easily have become simply repulsive. The show earned its first wave of award recognition relatively quickly, with Cranston winning his first Emmy for the role after just this initial, shortened season, a result that surprised some industry observers, given how few people had actually watched the show at that point, but one that reflected just how strongly the performance had registered with the smaller audience and voting body that had seen it. What the first season accomplished more than anything else was establishing the patient, character-driven storytelling approach that would define the entire series moving forward. Rather than rushing Walt into full-blown criminal activity, the season takes real time to show the messy, often clumsy reality of two amateurs trying to enter a business neither of them fully understands. Walt and Jesse's first cook together happens in a rented RV in the middle of the desert, a setup that is more improvised garage project than criminal enterprise. Their early attempts to sell the product go badly, leading to violent confrontations with more experienced criminals that neither man is equipped to handle. The season's most memorable early crisis involves Walt using his chemistry knowledge to dissolve a body using hydrofluoric acid, a scene that becomes darkly comic when the acid also destroys the bathtub the body was placed in, sending the melted remains crashing through the ceiling into the floor below. It is exactly the kind of scene that captures what made the show distinctive from the start. Horror and comedy, sitting uncomfortably close together. Violence handled not as spectacle, but as a logistical problem two unqualified men are struggling to solve. By the end of the first season, Walt has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. He has killed a man directly, strangling a rival drug dealer with a bike lock in an act of self-defense that nonetheless marks the first time he takes a human life with his own hands rather than through more distant, indirect means. The season closes with Walt's family beginning to sense that something is deeply wrong, even if they do not yet understand what, and with Walt himself settling into an uneasy equilibrium, having survived his first real brush with the criminal world he has chosen to enter. It is a modest, contained ending for a modest, contained season, one that gave little indication of just how far the story would eventually travel, or how completely the show would come to dominate conversations about television within just a few years. That transformation in the show's cultural standing would not happen through traditional broadcast viewership at all. It would happen through an entirely different distribution method that was only beginning to reshape how people watched television at the time. One that would turn a modestly watched cable drama into one of the most talked about shows in the world, almost overnight, years after it had first quietly premiered to a little over 1 million viewers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A quiet chemistry teacher had already crossed his first irreversible line by the end of season 1, though almost nobody was watching yet. Next, the strange, delayed way the world finally discovered Breaking Bad, and the platform that turned it into a phenomenon years after it premiered. Section 4. The show nobody watched until everyone did. For most of its early life, Breaking Bad existed as something of a critical secret, a show that journalists and television writers spoke about with real enthusiasm, while the actual viewing numbers stayed stubbornly modest. This gap between critical acclaim and audience size is not unusual in television history, but the way it eventually closed for Breaking Bad would end up changing the trajectory of the entire industry, not just the fortunes of one drama about a chemistry teacher. Through its first 3 seasons, Breaking Bad aired on AMC to audiences that, by the standards of network television, were quite small. The show was building a passionate following, the kind of viewers who discussed episodes online, who wrote long analytical pieces trying to unpack the show's moral architecture, who nominated it for the awards it kept winning, particularly in the acting categories, where Bryan Cranston's performance continued to draw attention year after year. But passionate is not the same as large. And AMC, still a relatively young player in the world of original scripted programming, did not have the marketing muscle or established audience base that networks like HBO or AMC's own later hit Mad Men had begun to cultivate. Breaking Bad was respected. It was not yet a phenomenon. The turning point arrived through a mechanism that almost nobody in television fully understood the implications of at the time. Netflix, then transitioning from a DVD rental service into a streaming platform, began acquiring the rights to stream television shows that had already aired on cable and broadcast networks. For a show like Breaking Bad, still airing new seasons on AMC, but with a growing backlog of earlier episodes that casual viewers had never seen, this arrangement created an entirely new pathway into the audience's attention. A person curious about the show no longer needed to track down DVDs or wait for reruns. They could simply open Netflix and begin watching from the very first episode, at their own pace, whenever they wanted. This ability to start from the beginning turned out to matter enormously for a show built the way Breaking Bad was built. Unlike a procedural drama, where any random episode might serve as a reasonable entry point, Breaking Bad rewarded, and in many ways demanded, being watched in order. The character work that Gilligan and his writers had been so patient in constructing, the slow accumulation of small compromises that eventually added up to genuine monstrousness, only fully lands when a viewer experiences it in sequence. Someone who stumbled onto a random third-season episode without context might see a frightening, ruthless man doing frightening, ruthless things. Someone who started from the pilot and watched Walt's transformation unfold gradually, episode by episode, experienced something closer to what the show's creators had actually built. A tragedy, in the classical sense, complete with its own internal logic and inevitability. Netflix's decision to make the full run of earlier seasons available just before the 4th season premiered on AMC created a kind of perfect storm for audience growth. New viewers, discovering the show for the first time through streaming, could binge through the earlier seasons in a matter of days, arriving just in time to catch up with the ongoing story as new episodes aired weekly on cable. This pattern of consumption, watching many episodes in rapid succession rather than spreading them out over weeks or months, was still a relatively novel behavior at the time, one that would eventually become the dominant way people consumed prestige television. But Breaking Bad was among the earliest and most visible beneficiaries of this shift. The show's own internal rhythm, built on cliffhangers and rising tension across multi-episode arcs, turned out to be almost perfectly suited to this new way of watching. Episodes like Half Measures and Crawl Space, later singled out by critics and fans as among the show's most tense hours, ended in states of such unresolved dread that clicking on the next episode immediately felt less like a choice and more like a necessity. The numbers tell their own story. about how dramatically this shift changed the show's fortunes. When the pilot aired in January of 2008, it drew a little over 1 million viewers, a number that stayed roughly in that range through the show's first several seasons on broadcast. By the time the series concluded with its finale in September of 2013, that number had grown to over 10 million viewers tuning in live, a roughly tenfold increase over the course of 5 years. That kind of growth for a scripted cable drama, especially one with subject matter as dark and uncompromising as Breaking Bad, was almost unprecedented at the time. And it happened specifically because streaming allowed the show's back catalog to keep finding new audiences even as the story itself moved forward on cable. This period of the show's real-life history overlapped with a corresponding deepening of the story itself, as the writers moved Walt and Jesse further into the world of organized drug manufacturing and distribution. Season 2 had already begun expanding the show's cast of antagonists and complicating its central partnership, introducing the volatile drug distributor Tuco Salamanca, and later, the mysterious, meticulous figure who would go on to become one of the show's most enduring creations, a fried chicken restaurant owner named Gustavo Fring. On the surface, Gus appeared to be nothing more than a soft-spoken, unfailingly polite businessman, the kind of person who remembers employees' names and takes genuine pride in customer service. Underneath that surface, audiences would slowly discover, was one of the most powerful and dangerous drug distributors in the entire American Southwest, a man who had built an empire of violence and precision, hidden almost entirely behind a facade of civic respectability. The introduction of Gus Fring marked an important escalation in the kind of story Breaking Bad was telling, where the show's earliest antagonists, figures like Tuco, operated with a kind of chaotic, unpredictable menace. Gus represented something colder and more calculated. He ran his criminal operation with the discipline of a Fortune 500 executive, compartmentalizing information, eliminating loose ends with clinical efficiency, and maintaining a public persona so convincing that even DEA agents investigating drug trafficking in the region had no reason to suspect him. For Walt, who had entered the drug trade almost by accident and had been improvising his way through increasingly dangerous situations, Gus represented both an opportunity and an existential threat. Gus offered Walt the kind of resources, the professional lab, the steady supply chain, the financial backing that could finally let his chemistry skills be used at their full potential. He also represented, almost from the moment he appeared on screen, a man who Walt would eventually need to either serve completely or destroy entirely, since Gus's brand of control left no real room for equal partnership. The seasons that unfolded during this period of the show's real-world breakthrough, roughly seasons 2 through 4, are often cited by critics and longtime fans as the stretch where Breaking Bad most fully became the show people now remember it as. It was during this period that Walt's transformation accelerated in ways that became harder to explain away as simple necessity. He begins making decisions that serve his own pride and ambition as much as, or more than, his family's financial security. He allows a girlfriend of Jesse's, a young woman named Jane, struggling with addiction, to choke to death in front of him, rather than intervene, a moment of passive cruelty that would later become one of the show's most devastating and consequential choices, one that Walt himself would eventually weaponize against Jesse in the show's final stretch of episodes. He begins lying, not just to protect his secret, but to protect his own sense of self-importance, manipulating people around him with an increasing coldness that had little to do with any external threat. This gradual hardening of Walt's character coincided with the show's growing willingness to let its protagonist do genuinely unforgivable things, without offering easy narrative comfort or clear moral judgment. Gilligan has spoken about his own guiding rule for the series during this period, a simple but demanding philosophy that actions have consequences, that nothing Walt did would simply be forgotten or forgiven by the story itself, even if it took years for those consequences to fully arrive. This commitment gave the show's darker turns a weight that distinguished it from other anti-hero dramas of the era. Walt was never protected by the narrative in the way some other morally compromised protagonists on television sometimes were. Every lie he told, every person he manipulated or harmed, eventually returned to complicate his life in ways he could not fully control. A structure Gilligan has compared to a kind of biblical sense of atonement, the belief that karma, however delayed, eventually finds its way back to a person. The Season 3 episode most frequently cited from this period as an outlier in the show's usual structure is an episode simply titled Fly, which takes place almost entirely within the confines of the underground meth lab, following Walt and Jesse across a single night as they become fixated on hunting down a single housefly that has somehow gotten into the supposedly sterile laboratory space. On its surface, the episode is almost absurdly small in scope compared to the sprawling criminal conspiracies surrounding it elsewhere in the season. But the fly hunt becomes a vehicle for one of the show's most intimate character studies, forcing Walt into a state of sleep-deprived vulnerability where old guilt, particularly guilt connected to Jane's death, threatens to spill out of him almost involuntarily. He comes close, in this episode, to confessing what he did, or failed to do, the night Jane died. The confession does not fully happen here. That moment, and the far more devastating way it eventually does happen, would be saved for one of the show's final and most acclaimed episodes years later, a connection that the same writer responsible for Fly would go on to craft with full, brutal intention. As Netflix's streaming numbers grew and word of mouth about the show intensified, AMC found itself managing a strange situation. A series whose critical and cultural importance was clearly rising, even as the network worked to figure out how to capitalize on an audience that increasingly discovered the show through a completely different platform than the one actually airing it. This tension between traditional broadcast metrics and streaming-driven cultural momentum would become a defining feature of the television industry in the years following Breaking Bad's run, but at the time, it was still a relatively new and somewhat confusing phenomenon for networks to navigate. AMC ultimately benefited enormously from this arrangement, since the growing streaming audience translated directly into larger live viewership for new episodes as each season progressed. But the network was, in a sense, riding a wave created by a distribution technology it did not fully control. By the time the fourth season aired, the show had fully entered the cultural conversation in a way that would have seemed unimaginable during its quiet, modestly watched first season. Gus Fring's storyline reached its climax during this stretch, culminating in one of the show's most visually and dramatically ambitious sequences, an assassination plot that Walt orchestrates with the same meticulous chemistry-based precision he had once reserved purely for cooking meth. The elimination of Gus Fring marked a major turning point for Walt's character, removing the last figure in the story who had genuine power over him, and leaving him, for the first time, as the most dangerous and capable person in his own criminal orbit. It is a moment the show frames with real ambiguity, a genuine triumph for Walt in the immediate context of the plot, and simultaneously, a deeply troubling sign of just how far he had traveled from the frightened, desperate man introduced in the pilot. This growing sense of triumph, the intoxicating feeling of finally being the most powerful person in any room he entered, would become one of the central psychological threads carried into the show's fifth and final season. Walt's stated justification for his actions, the idea that everything he did existed purely to provide for his family, had by this point become almost impossible to sustain, honestly, even within the show's own internal logic. The money he had already accumulated by the end of the fourth season far exceeded any reasonable calculation of what his family would need. What remained, increasingly, was not necessity, but appetite, a hunger for respect, power, and recognition that had nothing left to do with cancer treatments or college funds. The show's writers had spent years laying the groundwork for this shift, patiently, refusing to rush Walt's transformation, and by the time streaming audiences and live viewers alike were fully caught up and eagerly anticipating each new episode, the story had arrived at exactly the point Gilligan's original 9-word note had promised from the very beginning. A good man, having done bad things to save his family, discovering that the man capable of doing those things had very little left in common with the person he used to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A show that once drew barely 1 million viewers had, by its final stretch, become appointment television for millions, carried there by a technology nobody had fully planned around. Next, the character whose slow, quiet destruction became one of the show's most controversial and misunderstood storylines. Section 5. The wife everyone loved to hate, and why that says more about us than her. Of all the characters who moved through the story of Breaking Bad, none generated a more uncomfortable, more revealing reaction from the audience than Walter White's wife, Skyler. She was not a villain in any conventional sense. She was not particularly duplicitous, not cruel, not driven by greed or ambition, the way so many of the show's actual criminals were. And yet for years, a significant portion of the show's fan base directed a level of hostility toward her that surprised even the writers who created her, and that eventually became its own strange, revealing subplot running alongside the show itself, one that had less to do with the character on screen and more to do with the audience watching her. Skyler White is introduced in the pilot as a pregnant, somewhat harried wife and mother, juggling a household, a teenage son with cerebral palsy, an online auction side business, and a husband who seems perpetually distracted and distant. She is not given, in these earliest episodes, the same narrative spotlight that Walt receives. The story belongs to him, his diagnosis, his choice, his slow descent. And Skyler exists largely around the edges of that story, noticing that something is wrong with her husband, without yet understanding what. This structural reality, a story fundamentally centered on one character's internal transformation, would end up shaping how audiences related to everyone orbiting around him, but it shaped the reaction to Skyler in a particularly harsh and lasting way. As the series progressed and Skyler gradually uncovered the truth about Walt's secret life, the character's function within the story shifted. She was no longer simply an oblivious wife, waiting to be let in on the secret. She became an active obstacle, at times, to Walt's freedom of movement within his double life, asking questions he did not want to answer, growing suspicious of inconsistencies he had hoped would go unnoticed, and eventually confronting him directly with accusations he could not fully deny. From a narrative standpoint, this made Skyler functionally similar to any character standing between a protagonist and his goals in a traditional story structure. The difference, and the thing that would generate so much controversy, was that in Breaking Bad, the protagonist's goals were increasingly monstrous, and the person standing in his way was simply asking the reasonable questions any spouse might ask upon suspecting her husband was involved in something dangerous and illegal. Vince Gilligan has spoken directly about his intentions for the character, describing to actress Anna Gunn, who played Skyler, that he wanted the role written as a woman with a backbone of steel, someone who would not simply collapse into despair or helplessness once she learned the truth, and who would not quietly wring her hands in the background while her husband's crimes unfolded around her. Gilligan and his writers built Skyler as a multi-layered character, one who, in her own way, becomes morally compromised herself as the series progresses. making choices about how much to involve herself in Walt's business, how much money to accept, how far to go in covering for him, that complicate any simple reading of her as a purely innocent victim standing apart from the family's descent into crime. This complexity was, by Gilligan's own account, a deliberate choice, an attempt to give Skylar the same kind of moral texture that made every other major character on the show compelling rather than one-dimensional. Audiences, however, did not respond to that complexity the way the writers may have hoped. As the show's popularity grew, particularly once streaming exposed it to a much larger viewership, an increasingly vocal segment of fans began expressing intense dislike for Skylar, a dislike that in many cases went well beyond ordinary criticism of a fictional character's choices. Online message boards and early social media platforms became host to groups explicitly organized around hatred of the character, with names making clear their hostility, and with commentary that frequently strayed from critiquing Skylar's decisions into something closer to outright contempt for the idea of a wife who dared to question, resist, or judge her husband's behavior. Anna Gunn herself has described first becoming aware of the scale of this reaction during interviews and public appearances, recalling being told by people in Albuquerque, where the show filmed, just how intensely local fans had begun identifying her personally with the character they resented. The situation escalated to a point where Gunn felt compelled to address it publicly and directly, writing an opinion piece for the New York Times in the summer of 2013, shortly before the show's final episodes aired. In that piece, titled with a note of dry irony, calling attention to having a character issue, Gunn described the strange experience of watching internet hatred for a fictional character gradually blur into something aimed at her personally as a human being. She wrote about glimpsing an anger that had, at first, simply bewildered her, an intensity of hostility that seemed disproportionate to anything her character had actually done within the story. She described finding comments online expressing a desire to locate her in real life in order to do her harm, a level of vitriol that moved the conversation well past ordinary fan grumbling about an unlikable character and into something considerably darker. What Gunn argued in that piece, and what she and others connected to the show would continue to argue in the years afterward, was that the reaction to Skylar reflected something larger than simple storytelling preferences. She suggested that Skylar had become, in her words, a kind of Rorschach test for society, a measure of attitudes toward gender and toward women who refused to quietly accept a husband's bad behavior. She noted that this pattern was not unique to Breaking Bad, drawing comparisons to the similarly intense backlash faced by January Jones for her portrayal of Betty Draper on Mad Men, and Edie Falco for her portrayal of Carmela Soprano on The Sopranos, two other television wives married to charismatic, morally compromised anti-heroes who likewise drew disproportionate audience hostility. Gunn observed that male characters on television rarely seem to inspire this same kind of intense, personal public venting, regardless of how flawed or difficult those characters might be written to be. The response to Gunn's op-ed itself became something of a case study in how divisive this topic remained even after she spoke about it directly. Some commentators agreed entirely with her reading of the situation, pointing to the specific language used against Skylar online, language that frequently focused on her supposedly nagging or shrewish behavior in ways rarely applied to male characters exhibiting comparable frustration or suspicion. Others pushed back, arguing that Skylar's unpopularity had less to do with gender and more to do with specific storytelling choices, suggesting that her character had, at certain points in the show's run, been given less nuanced material to work with than some of the show's other female characters, making her harder for some viewers to connect with, regardless of any broader social pattern. This debate has continued for years since the show ended, resurfacing periodically whenever the topic of Skylar White comes up in interviews or retrospective pieces about the series. One particularly telling moment, illustrating how persistent this discussion has remained, came years after the show's conclusion, during a joint interview segment featuring both Bryan Cranston and his former Malcolm in the Middle co-star, Frankie Muniz. During that conversation, Muniz made a joking comment suggesting that killing off Skylar earlier in the series would have made Walt's life, and by extension the show's storytelling, considerably easier, framing her character as someone who existed mainly to complain and create obstacles. Cranston, visibly taken aback by the comment, pushed back directly in defense of both the character and Gunn's performance, making clear that he did not share that assessment of Skylar's role within the story. The exchange, occurring more than a decade after the show ended, demonstrated just how deeply entrenched certain attitudes toward the character had become, persisting long after most other conversations about the show had moved on to other topics. Looking back at Skylar's actual arc across the series, with some distance from the initial online firestorm, a more complicated picture emerges than either her harshest critics or her most protective defenders often acknowledge. Skylar is not written as a saint, standing apart from her husband's crimes, watching helplessly from a place of pure moral clarity. She makes her own compromised choices once she understands the truth, at times actively helping Walt cover his tracks, engaging with the practical business of laundering the money his crimes generate, and on at least one occasion, using the couple's young daughter as a kind of prop to help Walt project an image of respectable domestic normalcy during a tense confrontation with his business partner. She is, in other words, exactly the kind of morally gray character Gilligan has described wanting to write. A person making imperfect decisions under increasingly impossible circumstances, much like every other major character in the show's ensemble. What made the intensity of the audience reaction to her specifically so notable, according to Gunn and various critics who have examined the phenomenon since, was the gap between the scale of Skylar's actual transgressions and the scale of the hostility directed at her, especially when measured against audience reactions to male characters within the same story, who committed vastly more serious and violent acts. Walt himself, over the course of the series, orders and commits multiple murders, manipulates and endangers nearly everyone in his life, and allows a young woman to die in front of him without intervening. And yet he retained, for much of the show's run, a significant base of fans who continued to root for him, defend his choices, and resist fully condemning him even as his actions grew more indefensible by the episode. Skylar, whose worst offenses amounted to enabling and occasionally participating in crimes she had not chosen and initially opposed, drew a hostility that in raw intensity often outpaced anything directed at the man actually committing the violence. This disparity became, in the years following the show's conclusion, a frequently cited example within broader conversations about how television audiences respond differently to male and female characters occupying structurally similar positions within a narrative. Writers and critics examining the phenomenon have pointed out that Skylar's specific sin, in the eyes of her harshest critics, appeared to be her refusal to simply accept her husband's behavior quietly, her insistence on asking questions, expressing anger, and at times threatening to leave or expose him. Where Walt's transformation from mild-mannered teacher into ruthless criminal was framed by many viewers as a kind of dark wish fulfillment, an empowerment fantasy for anyone who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated, Skylar's parallel journey toward assertiveness and resistance within her own household was frequently read by that same audience as nagging, as an obstacle, as something to be resented rather than understood. The show itself, to its credit, never entirely abandoned Skylar's perspective, even during the periods when audience hostility toward the character ran hottest. The final stretch of episodes, particularly the harrowing sequence that follows the revelation of Walt's secret to the rest of his family, give Skylar some of the most emotionally devastating material of the entire series. Moments that many critics have since pointed to as a kind of quiet vindication of everything Gunn had been arguing about the character for years. By the time the story reaches its conclusion, Skylar is left physically and emotionally hollowed out by everything Walt's choices have cost her. Living in a stripped-down apartment, working as a bookkeeper, having lost her home, her sense of safety, and any remaining illusion about the man she married. It is, in its own bleak way, one of the more honest depictions the show offers of what actually happens to the people left standing in the wreckage of an anti-hero's rise and fall, long after the audience has stopped cheering for the man responsible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A character built with real complexity became, for a portion of the audience, something closer to a scapegoat, revealing as much about viewers as it did about the story itself. Next, the criminal empire Walt eventually built for himself, and the quietly terrifying man who ran the business before him. Section 6. The Chicken Man Who Hid a Kingdom in Plain Sight. Some of the most memorable characters in television history arrive fully formed, planned from the very beginning, to occupy the space they eventually fill. Gus Fring was not one of those characters. He entered Breaking Bad almost as an afterthought, a temporary solution to a scheduling problem, and slowly, through the choices of one actor working in almost total stillness, grew into one of the most acclaimed villains the medium had ever produced. The character's existence traces back to a piece of real-world production trouble that had nothing to do with story planning. Raymond Cruz, the actor who had played the volatile, unpredictable drug distributor Tuco Salamanca during the first season, was unavailable to continue in the role heading into Season 2, tied up with a prior commitment to another television project. Rather than recasting Tuco with a different actor, the writers made the decision to write him out of the story entirely and build something new in his place. A character who would function as his deliberate opposite. Where Tuco had operated with chaotic, drug-fueled unpredictability, screaming and lashing out with almost no warning, the writers wanted his replacement to embody something colder. According to accounts from the writer's room, the character was conceived from the start as a buttoned-down, cold-blooded, soft-spoken businessman, someone whose menace would come from restraint rather than volatility. The actor cast to bring this new character to life was Giancarlo Esposito, a performer with a long and varied career, stretching back to childhood, having made his Broadway debut at the age of 8, and later working with directors like Spike Lee on films including Do the Right Thing. Despite decades of steady work, Esposito had struggled for years against a kind of stereotypical casting common for actors with his particular background. Born in Copenhagen to an Italian father and an African-American mother, a combination that left him frequently pushed toward narrowly defined ethnic roles, rather than the range of parts his talent could clearly support. By his own account, in the years before Breaking Bad, his career and personal finances had reached a genuinely desperate point, following a divorce and a bankruptcy filing severe enough that he has said he once considered arranging his own death in order to provide insurance money for his 4 daughters. It was from that low point that the opportunity to audition for a small guest role on a little-watched cable drama arrived. Esposito has spoken about the specific detail in the script that first pulled him toward the character. A single phrase buried in the stage directions describing Gus as someone hiding in plain sight. That phrase resonated with him on a deeply personal level, describing it later as capturing something true about his own life. A sense of concealing who he really was, out of fear that people would see through him. He channeled that personal recognition directly into how he chose to build the character physically and vocally, making a deliberate decision to play Gus as someone extremely still, someone who listened far more than he spoke. Esposito has explained that this went against his natural instincts as a performer, since actors are typically drawn toward expression and movement, the very things that stir a performance to life. Restraint required him to find a different kind of internal intensity, one that could register clearly to an audience without ever spilling out into visible action. The role, as originally conceived and offered to Esposito, was modest in scope, intended to last only 1 or 2 episodes as a guest appearance, introducing a mysterious new supplier without any expectation that the character would return. Esposito has described shooting those first 2 episodes and sensing, even without confirmation, that there might be an opportunity for more, largely because of how strongly the stillness he had chosen seemed to be landing on screen. That instinct proved correct. After those initial appearances, the production reached out to ask whether he would be interested in extending the role, and Esposito has said that once he understood the depth of Vince Gilligan's vision for where the character could go, he brought his own ideas to the table as well, building on the writing rather than simply executing it. What emerged from this expanded collaboration was a character whose menace worked almost entirely through contrast and restraint. Gus Fring, on the surface, appeared to be nothing more than the founder and public face of a modest but successful fast food chain called Los Pollos Hermanos, a chicken restaurant known for its careful attention to customer service and its owner's habit of personally checking in on staff and guests. He spoke with careful, measured politeness, addressing even his enemies with a kind of formal courtesy that made his eventual acts of violence land with far greater shock than they would have from a more openly menacing figure. Beneath that surface, audiences gradually learned Gus ran one of the most sophisticated methamphetamine distribution operations in the American Southwest, using both his restaurant chain and an industrial laundry facility as fronts to launder the enormous profits his criminal enterprise generated. The character's backstory, revealed gradually across his time on the show, gave this careful public persona a deeper and more personal foundation. Gus had once been in business with a close associate and, the show strongly implies, a romantic partner named Max, a relationship destroyed years earlier when a cartel enforcer named Hector Salamanca had Max killed as part of a broader territorial dispute. Gus's entire criminal operation, built over decades with meticulous patience, existed in part as a long, slow campaign of revenge against Hector and the cartel connected to him. A vendetta pursued with the same discipline and control that defined every other aspect of how Gus conducted himself. This gave the character an emotional dimension that distinguished him from a purely mercenary villain, a man whose coldness masked genuine, long-buried grief rather than an absence of feeling altogether. For Walter White, Gus represented something the story had not yet offered him, a version of criminal success built on professionalism rather than chaos. Where Walt's earlier adversaries, men like Tuco, operated on instinct and volatility, Gus ran his operation like a carefully managed corporation, with clean supply chains, careful compartmentalization of information, and a public identity so convincing that law enforcement investigating drug trafficking in the region had no reason to suspect a respected local businessman. Gus offered Walt access to that level of professionalism, providing him with a pristine, custom-built laboratory hidden beneath the industrial laundry facility, a space that allowed Walt's chemistry skills to finally be applied without the constant improvisation and danger that had defined his earlier attempts to cook in far less controlled conditions. That partnership, however, was never built to last as an equal arrangement, and both men seemed to understand this from very early in their association. Gus valued Walt for his singular chemistry talent, the ability to produce a product of a purity that no other cook in the region could match, but he had no interest in sharing power with him, and he made clear through small, precise gestures of control just how little patience he had for Walt's ego or independence. Walt, in turn, chafed increasingly under an arrangement that required him to follow orders from someone else, a dynamic that struck at exactly the wound his character had carried since the earliest episodes, the sense of being underestimated, overlooked, and controlled by other people, despite his own conviction of his superior intelligence and ability. The tension between the two men escalated across the show's third and fourth seasons into one of the most closely watched rivalries in the series, built almost entirely on quiet, controlled confrontations rather than open violence, at least at first. Gus demonstrated his capacity for brutality early and unambiguously during one especially shocking sequence, when he calmly, and without any visible change in demeanor, executed a subordinate with a box cutter as a lesson to everyone watching, including Jesse, about the consequences of disloyalty within his organization. The scene became one of the show's most talked about moments, specifically because of how thoroughly it violated audience expectations about how such violence is typically staged, delivered not through screaming rage, but through the same unhurried, courteous calm Gus brought to every other interaction. As the rivalry between Walt and Gus intensified, the story built toward a resolution that would require Walt to demonstrate a level of ruthlessness and cunning that matched or exceeded his adversary's own. The eventual confrontation, arriving at the climax of the fourth season, involved an elaborate plot built on the same principle that had defined Walt's earliest successful escape from danger back in the first season, using his chemistry expertise to engineer an explosive device capable of eliminating a target who could not be reasoned with or overpowered through ordinary means. The sequence culminates in a bombing that ends Gus Fring's life, along with his connections to the cartel he had spent years quietly working to destroy, closing out one of the show's most significant villain arcs in a single, meticulously constructed episode. The character's legacy within the broader story of Breaking Bad, and within television history more generally, extended well beyond his own screen time. Critics and fans alike have consistently ranked Gus among the finest villains ever written for the medium, with multiple industry outlets naming him among the most memorable antagonists across the decade following the show's initial run. Esposito's performance earned him repeated award recognition, including wins and nominations that continued even after his original run on the show ended, a testament to how completely he had defined the character during his relatively limited number of episodes. When the prequel series Better Call Saul began exploring the years before Breaking Bad's events, Gus Fring returned as a major figure across multiple seasons, giving Esposito the opportunity to build out the character's earlier history in even greater depth, exploring the specific relationship with Max and the slow, careful construction of the empire that Walt would eventually collide with years later. What made Gus such an effective foil for Walter White, and what continues to make the character such a compelling subject for analysis, was the way he represented an alternate version of the same fundamental hunger driving the show's protagonist. Both men were, at their core, driven by pride, by a need for control, and by a conviction that their own intelligence and discipline entitled them to power over the people around them. The difference lay almost entirely in temperament and patience. Gus had spent decades building his empire, with total control over his own emotions, using restraint as his primary weapon. Walt, by contrast, remained a man of volatile impulse, dressed in the language of careful planning, someone whose ego could never quite be fully contained, no matter how much he tried to convince himself and others that his choices were purely rational. It was, in the end, precisely that difference that allowed Walt to eventually outmaneuver a man who had spent far longer mastering the criminal world Walt had only recently entered, a victory that came at enormous cost and that pushed Walt one significant step further along the path from mild-mannered teacher toward the man the story had always been building toward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A guest role meant to last 2 episodes became one of television's most acclaimed villains, built almost entirely on stillness and restraint. Next, the single hour of television that Vince Gilligan himself called the best the show ever produced, and the devastating choices that made it that way. Section 7. The Hour. Vince Gilligan called the best the show would ever make. By the time Breaking Bad reached its 5th and final season, the show had already produced enough acclaimed, tightly constructed episodes to fill several careers. But when Vince Gilligan was asked, near the end of the show's run, to name the single best episode the series had ever produced, he did not hesitate over the answer. In an interview given shortly before the finale aired, Gilligan called an episode titled Ozymandias the best episode the show had ever had or ever would have. It is a striking claim from a man who had written and directed the series finale himself, and yet watching the episode in question, it becomes difficult to argue with his assessment. Ozymandias arrived as the 60th episode overall, the 14th of the 5th season, airing in the middle of September in 2013. It picks up immediately where the previous episode left off, continuing directly from a desert standoff between Walt, his crew of neo-Nazi allies, and the DEA agents who had finally caught up with him, chief among them his own brother-in-law, Hank Schrader. The episode opens in a choice that feels almost cruel in retrospect, with a flashback to the very earliest days of Walt and Jesse's partnership, showing the two of them inside the RV during their very first cook together, back when Walt was still teaching Jesse the basics of chemistry, with the patient enthusiasm of a man discovering an unexpected gift for mentorship. In that same flashback, Walt makes a call to a still pregnant Skylar, lying to her about working late, the two of them casually discussing names for the daughter who will eventually be born. It is a small, tender scene, and the production made a specific choice to film it as the very last sequence shot for the entire series, delaying it deliberately so that Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul's hair could grow back to match how they had looked years earlier in the pilot. A level of continuity care that speaks to just how seriously the production treated even a few seconds of screen time. That flashback dissolves into the desert of the present. And from there, the episode does not let up. The writer responsible for turning this collection of devastating plot points into a finished script was Moira Wally Beckett, a member of the show's writing staff who had joined the series years earlier, and who, by her own account, was assigned the episode purely through the ordinary rotation the writer's room used to divide up scripts. She has described the process candidly in interviews, explaining that writers on the show typically produced a detailed outline first, something closer to a short novella running 15 to 20 pages, before being given roughly 10 days to turn that outline into a finished script, working largely alone during that stretch. The chips, as she put it, simply happened to fall on her for the episode carrying the heaviest emotional weight of the entire series. Wally Beckett requested that the episode be directed by Rian Johnson, a filmmaker she had worked with previously on the acclaimed Season 3 episode Fly, the same bottle episode discussed earlier in this look at the show's history, built around Walt and Jesse's fixation on a single housefly inside the meth lab. The two had developed what she described as a close creative partnership during that earlier collaboration, and she specifically sought him out again for Ozymandias, describing the two of them as partners in crime working through the material together. Their collaboration on this episode went further than usual, with both of them overseeing the final cut together, an arrangement Wally Beckett has said was a first for her on the show, reflecting just how much trust and creative freedom she had been given for this particular hour. The episode begins its assault on the audience almost immediately once it returns to the present timeline. Hank, who has spent years obsessively pursuing the drug kingpin known as Heisenberg, without ever suspecting his own brother-in-law, is killed by the neo-Nazi enforcer Uncle Jack, executed in the desert, despite Walt's desperate, genuinely pleading offer to give up his entire remaining fortune, $80 million, in exchange for Hank's life. Jack refuses, understanding as clearly as Hank himself does that a federal agent who has seen what Hank has seen cannot simply be released. The moment Hank dies, something in Walt visibly breaks, his body collapsing to the ground in stages. A physical reaction the show deliberately echoes from an earlier moment years before, when Gus Fring reacted with similarly delayed, cascading grief after witnessing the death of his own close associate Max. It is a small detail, easy to miss on a first viewing, but one that draws a quiet, devastating line between two men who have each spent the series discovering exactly how much devastation their choices can produce. Wally Beckett has spoken about the significance of Hank's death within the larger structure of the episode and the series as a whole, explaining that once that gunshot goes off, whatever delusions Walt had still been telling himself about his reasons for staying in the criminal world are obliterated completely. For years, Walt had clung to the justification that everything he did existed for the sake of his family. But Hank's death makes brutally clear that his continued involvement in this world has now cost him one of the people closest to him, a man who was, in his own way, family. There is no framing left available to Walt after this point that allows him to see himself as anything other than directly responsible for what has happened. The episode does not pause to let that devastation breathe before delivering its next blow. Walt turns his attention to Jesse, who has been hiding beneath a nearby vehicle throughout the standoff, and in a moment of raw, uncontrolled fury, very nearly has Jesse killed as well, motivated by his belief, mistaken as it turns out, that Jesse has been secretly working with the DEA and the Nazi crew against him. Jesse is spared only through the intervention of Todd Alquist, the young, disturbingly polite member of Jack's crew, who requests that Jesse be kept alive to continue cooking for them, a request framed with the same eerie, businesslike calm that made Todd such an unsettling addition to the show's rotating cast of antagonists in its final stretch. What follows is one of the most quietly brutal moments of the entire series. Before Jesse is taken away into what will become months of imprisonment and forced labor, Walt reveals to him, apparently as a final act of pure cruelty rather than any strategic purpose, the truth about Jane's death years earlier, admitting that he watched her choke and die and made the deliberate choice not to save her. Wally Beckett has discussed this confession in some detail, noting that it directly echoes a moment from the earlier episode Fly, where Walt had come close to admitting the same truth to Jesse, but ultimately held back. She has described the emotional difference between those two moments, with real precision, explaining that had Walt made that confession back in Fly, it would have come from a place of guilt, shame, and even love, an attempt to unburden himself honestly to someone he cared about. Making the same confession here, in Ozymandias, transforms it into something else entirely. Wally Beckett has said plainly that Walt essentially murders Jesse in that moment, using the truth as a weapon rather than an act of honesty, delivering it purely to inflict maximum pain on a young man who is about to be dragged away into captivity. It is one of the clearest illustrations in the entire series of just how completely Walt's capacity for basic human decency has eroded by this point in the story. From the desert, the episode follows Walt home, where the confrontation with his own family delivers the final and perhaps most devastating sequence of the hour. Skylar, upon seeing Walt arrive at the house rather than in police custody, immediately understands what his presence means, correctly deducing that Hank must be dead and that Walt is responsible. What follows is a physical struggle between Walt and Skylar over a kitchen knife, an altercation their teenage son Walter Jr. witnesses in horror, ultimately intervening to physically pull his father off his mother. In a moment that crystallizes just how completely Walt's family has turned against him, Walter Jr. calls the police himself, choosing without hesitation to protect his mother rather than shield his father. A reversal of loyalty that closes off any remaining illusion Walt might have held about being seen as a protector within his own household. Faced with the total collapse of everything he has built and everyone he claimed to be protecting, Walt makes one final, desperate, and deeply troubling decision, taking his infant daughter Holly from her crib and fleeing the house with her, apparently intending to raise her alone. It is only later, driving through the desert, that the reality of what he is doing seems to break through his panic, and he makes the decision to leave Holly at a fire station, ensuring she will be found and safely returned to her mother. Before that, however, comes one of the episode's most quietly harrowing details, added through improvisation rather than scripted intention. During the earlier struggle in the bathroom, the young actress playing Holly began crying out for her mother, an unplanned moment that occurred because the child's real mother happened to be standing behind Bryan Cranston during filming, catching her daughter's eye and prompting the repeated cries. Cranston, rather than breaking the shot, simply continued the scene as written, and the resulting footage, raw and unrehearsed, made it into the finished episode. According to accounts from the production, the camera operator filming the scene was so affected by what he was capturing that he had to pull his eye away from the eyepiece partway through. Before leaving his family behind entirely, Walt makes one final phone call to Skylar, a scene that would go on to become the subject of extensive debate among critics and fans for years after the episode aired. In the call, Walt speaks to Skylar with apparent venom, blaming her for everything that has happened, calling her stupid for ever standing in his way, and asserting complete ownership over the empire he built entirely by himself. On its surface, the call reads as one final act of cruelty from a man lashing out at the person he holds responsible for his downfall. Wally Beckett has stated directly, however, that the scene was never intended to leave that interpretation open to debate, explaining that audiences were meant to understand the call as a calculated performance, one Walt delivers loudly enough to be recorded by the police he knows are likely listening in, constructing a version of events designed to clear Skylar's name of any criminal involvement by making it appear she was simply a terrified victim of his abuse, rather than any kind of willing participant. It is, in its own twisted way, one of the only unambiguously protective acts Walt performs in the entire episode, wrapped so completely in performative cruelty that many viewers initially missed the intention behind it altogether. The episode closes with Walt alone, having lost his brother-in-law, his son's respect, his wife's trust, and his partnership with Jesse, driving away from Albuquerque toward an uncertain future, having arranged through Saul Goodman's network to disappear and assume a new identity. The final shot lingers on the vast, unchanged emptiness of the desert landscape, indifferent to everything that has just occurred within it, a visual echo of the poem the episode takes its title from. That title, Ozymandias, refers to the Percy Shelley poem describing the crumbled, forgotten statue of a once mighty and arrogant ruler, a monument to power that has long since been swallowed by sand and time, with nothing left beside it but the boundless, level emptiness stretching in every direction. Wally Beckett has said that she had wanted to use the poem as a title for a long time before this episode gave her the opportunity. And though the episode never explicitly references Shelley's words on screen, the parallel between Walt's shattered empire and the poem's fallen king has become one of the most frequently analyzed connections in the show's entire run. The critical and industry response to the episode, both immediately and in the years since, has been almost unanimously reverent. Ozymandias holds a rare distinction on the review aggregation platform IMDb, having received the highest possible rating from an enormous number of user reviews, making it, by that particular measure, the highest-rated single episode of television ever recorded on the platform. At the Emmy Awards following the episode's release, Moira Walley-Beckett won the award for Outstanding Writing for a Drama Series, becoming the first woman to win that specific award as a sole writer in 2 decades, defeating a field that included Gilligan himself, nominated for his work on the series finale. Bryan Cranston and Anna Gunn also won acting awards specifically tied to their performances in this episode, a rare instance of a single hour of television generating major award wins across writing and both lead acting categories simultaneously. What makes Ozymandias endure as the episode most frequently cited when critics discuss the show's finest achievement is not simply the density of devastating events packed into a single hour, though that density is genuinely remarkable. It is the way every one of those events had been earned by years of careful, patient storytelling that came before it. Hank's death carries weight because the show had spent 5 seasons building the relationship between him and Walt with real texture and history. Walt's cruelty toward Jesse lands with such force because the audience had watched that relationship evolve from mentorship into something far more complicated and painful across dozens of prior episodes. Skyler's fear and Walter Jr.'s fury make sense only because the show had spent so long tracking the slow, agonizing process by which this family's trust in Walt eroded piece by piece. Ozymandias functions less as a single great episode, and more as the moment where every seed the show had planted since its very first hour finally, simultaneously, came to full and terrible fruition. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In a single devastating hour, everything Walter White had built came apart at once, and the show's creator called it the finest work the series would ever produce. Next, the man's final weeks alone, and the ending Vince Gilligan chose to give one of television's most notorious anti-heroes. Section 8. Alone in the Snow, Waiting to Disappear. After the devastation of Ozymandias, Breaking Bad slowed down deliberately, choosing to spend its penultimate episode not on action or spectacle, but on the quiet, grinding reality of what it actually looks like when a man loses absolutely everything and has nowhere left to go. That episode, titled Granite State, functions almost as the opposite of the hour that came before it, trading chaos and violence for isolation and stillness. And in doing so, it prepares both Walt and the audience for the ending that would follow. By the time Granite State begins, Walt has already fled Albuquerque with the help of Saul Goodman's network of contacts, arrangements built specifically for clients who need to disappear entirely and start over under a new identity. The man responsible for executing that disappearance is a character known only as the Disappearer, or by his given name Ed, who runs a vacuum repair shop as a front for smuggling people into new lives far from anyone who might recognize them. Walt's version of this new life turns out to be about as far from his old one as geography allows, relocated to a remote cabin in rural New Hampshire, isolated by distance, weather, and his own advancing illness, forced to live out whatever time he has left, almost entirely alone. The New Hampshire sequences that dominate much of this episode represent some of the bleakest material the show ever produced, precisely because they strip away everything that had once made Walt's story feel propulsive and exciting. There is no chemistry to perfect here, no rival to outmaneuver, no family to provide for in any meaningful sense. There is only a sick, aging man sitting inside a snowbound cabin, receiving a single delivery of supplies once a month from Ed, passing the hours with nothing to do but sit with the consequences of every choice that brought him to this point. Bryan Cranston has spoken in interviews about the physical transformation required for this stretch of the series, and the show visually reinforces Walt's decline through his appearance. Gaunt, wrapped in blankets, his cancer clearly worsening without the treatment that had kept it manageable during better times. It is during this period of enforced isolation that Walt makes contact, indirectly, with two figures from his distant past, Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, the former colleagues and friends who had once offered to cover his medical expenses back in the earliest episodes of the series, an offer Walt's pride had led him to refuse. Watching Elliot and Gretchen appear on a television interview discussing Walt's public reputation, distancing themselves from him and minimizing his actual contributions to the chemistry company they built together decades earlier, ignites something in Walt that had apparently been lying dormant beneath his exhaustion and resignation. Seeing his own legacy erased and rewritten by two people he has resented for years proves to be the spark that pulls him out of his isolated stupor and back toward Albuquerque, despite the enormous risk that decision represents, given the scale of the manhunt underway to find him. This moment carries real thematic weight within the larger arc of the series, because it reveals something Walt himself seems only partially aware of. After everything that has happened, after the death of Hank, after the destruction of his family's trust, after months of isolation with nothing left to lose, what finally moves him to action is not concern for his family's financial security or any lingering desire for reconciliation. It is wounded pride, the same emotional wound that had driven his refusal of Elliot and Gretchen's help all the way back in Season 1. The show draws a quiet, devastating circle here, showing that whatever Walt has become over 5 seasons, the fundamental engine driving him has never really changed. He has always, at his core, been a man who cannot tolerate being diminished or forgotten, and that need proves powerful enough to override even his own survival instincts. Before Walt leaves New Hampshire, Granite State also delivers one of its quieter but equally important developments, following Jesse's fate during the same stretch of time. Having been captured and forced into servitude by Uncle Jack's crew following the events of Ozymandias, Jesse spends this period as a prisoner, chained and forced to cook meth for his captors, under threat of violence toward anyone he might try to protect, including a woman he had briefly formed a connection with earlier in the season, whose safety is used explicitly to keep him compliant. The show does not shy away from depicting the toll this imprisonment takes on him, both physically and psychologically, continuing to develop Jesse's arc as one of the series' most sustained and painful examples of a person trapped by consequences that were never fully his own to control, even as he bears an enormous share of the suffering. Granite State ends with Walt making the decision to return to Albuquerque, setting in motion the events that will unfold across the show's final episode. It is worth pausing on just how carefully the show had constructed this final act of Walt's journey by this point. The series had spent its entire run resisting easy narrative comfort, refusing to let its protagonist's actions go unanswered, and the isolation of Granite State represented, in a sense, the closest thing to a genuine reckoning Walt experiences before the story's conclusion. He is not punished here through violence or arrest. He is punished through irrelevance, through loneliness, through watching from a distance as the world moves on without him, indifferent to the man who once considered himself its most dangerous and important figure. When the series finale, titled Felina, finally arrived on the 29th of September in 2013, it carried the weight of an ending that audiences had been anticipating with an intensity rarely seen in television history by that point. Written and directed by Vince Gilligan himself, the episode marked his 4th turn both writing and directing a single hour of the series, following the pilot years earlier and 2 other significant episodes along the way. The symmetry of Gilligan personally bookending the story, shaping both its beginning and its end with his own hands, added a layer of authorial closure that felt appropriate, given how personal the entire project had always been to him. Gilligan has spoken candidly about how difficult and even frightening the process of writing this finale actually was. In one particularly revealing account, he described how the show's writers had introduced the image of a machine gun mounted in the trunk of Walt's car during an earlier flash-forward at the very start of the 5th season, without actually knowing at the time who that weapon would eventually be used against. Several possibilities were considered as the season developed, including having Walt use the weapon against police officers, or deploying it in some kind of dramatic effort to free Jesse from captivity through direct assault. Both of these options were eventually discarded, with Gilligan explaining simply that they did not feel right for the story the show had been telling. The version that ultimately made it to screen, involving a remote-controlled turret built into the trunk of Walt's car, mechanically rigged to spray gunfire across a room once triggered, arrived only after considerable experimentation with what kind of ending would actually serve the characters, rather than simply deliver spectacle for its own sake. The finale opens with Walt still in New Hampshire, attempting to steal a car in the freezing cold, an opening scene that Gilligan has described as deliberately echoing a kind of quiet, secular prayer, with Walt pleading under his breath, simply to be allowed to get home so that he can finish what he has started. From there, the episode follows Walt as he methodically works through a list of final tasks, beginning with a visit to Elliot and Gretchen's home, where he stages an elaborate and ultimately theatrical threat against them, using 2 of his former associates, Badger and Skinny Pete, equipped with nothing more dangerous than laser pointers standing in for sniper rifles, to convince the couple that they are in mortal danger unless they agree to funnel the remainder of Walt's drug money to his son through a carefully constructed trust, timed to be delivered on his 18th birthday. It is one of the episode's more darkly comic sequences, and it reveals that even in his final days, Walt retains his capacity for elaborate, theatrical manipulation, though this time it is aimed at securing something for his family rather than protecting himself. From there, the episode moves toward its climactic sequence at the compound belonging to Uncle Jack's crew of white supremacists, where Jesse remains imprisoned. Walt arrives with the trunk-mounted weapon primed and ready, initially intending, by his own admission during the confrontation, to eliminate everyone present, including Jesse himself, having become convinced that Jesse had willingly joined forces with the men holding him captive. That intention shifts the moment Jack drags Jesse into the room in chains, and Walt sees clearly, for perhaps the first time in months, the extent of the physical and psychological damage Jesse has suffered. Gilligan has compared this moment directly to a pivotal scene in the classic John Wayne Western Beaser, The Searchers, in which a character who has spent an entire film pursuing someone with violent intent finds, at the last possible moment, some remaining capacity for mercy, once actually confronted with the person in front of him. What follows is one of the most brutal and cathartic sequences in the entire series. The hidden weapon activates, tearing through the room and killing nearly everyone present except Walt himself, who takes a bullet during the chaos, but survives long enough to finish what remains of his plan. Jack, cornered and desperate, attempts to bargain for his life by offering to reveal the location of the money still owed to Walt, but Walt, in a moment that closes the loop on Hank's death in the previous act, shoots him without hesitation, refusing the same kind of bargain that Jack had refused Walt when Hank's life had been on the line. Jesse, freed at last from the chains that had bound him for months, discovers Todd, already incapacitated, and in one of the show's most viscerally satisfying moments of earned violence, strangles him to death, using the very chains that had kept him captive. A moment of vengeance the show frames, without any of the moral ambiguity it typically applies to Walt's own acts of violence. In the sequence that follows, Walt offers Jesse the chance to kill him directly, handing him the opportunity for one final act of retribution after everything Walt has put him through. Jesse refuses, choosing instead to simply leave, driving away from the compound in a state of visible, overwhelming relief, laughing and crying simultaneously as he speeds off into the night in a car that would later lend its name to the sequel film, continuing his story. The two men exchange a final look before Jesse departs, wordless, carrying the weight of everything they have been through together, without any need for further explanation. Walt's own ending arrives shortly after, and it is here that the finale delivers its most quietly devastating moment. Making his way through the meth lab he had once helped design during his partnership with Gus Fring, mortally wounded, Walt walks slowly among the equipment that had once represented, in a strange way, the only place where he had ever felt truly capable and alive. According to Gilligan, this final image was meant to convey something specific about what Walt actually valued above everything else, comparing the moment to the relationship a character in The Lord of the Rings has with a cherished, corrupting object, referring to the lab as Walt's own version of that same kind of possession. Walt touches the equipment one final time, reminded of how it made him feel, before collapsing to the floor as police officers arrive too late to take him alive, dying surrounded by the machinery of his own creation, rather than in the company of any of the people he claimed, for so long, to have done everything for. The choice of music playing over this final sequence, a song called Baby Blue by the band Badfinger, drew some disagreement during the editing process, with the show's own music supervisors initially favoring different options before Gilligan insisted on this particular track. According to the supervisor who eventually worked to finalize the choice, once the finished shot of Walt's death was viewed in context, the reasoning behind Gilligan's insistence became clear, and no other option under consideration carried the same weight once paired with the completed footage. The song's lyrics, referencing a devotion to something called Baby Blue, function as a final, quiet acknowledgement of the show's own visual signature, the distinctive blue tint of the meth Walt had spent years perfecting, suggesting that, despite everything the drug had cost him and everyone around him, some part of Walt never stopped loving the thing he had created. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A man who once claimed everything he did was for his family died alone among machines, having finally admitted what he had actually been chasing all along. Next, how critics and audiences reacted to that ending, and the debate over whether Walter White got away with it. Section 9. Did he get away with it? And does that question even matter? When Felina finally aired, closing out 5 seasons of television in a single 63-minute episode, the reaction from critics and audiences arrived with unusual speed and unusual near unanimity, at least at first. Reviewers across major publications responded with the kind of praise reserved for events, rather than ordinary television episodes. Donna Bowman, writing for the AV Club, gave the episode a perfect grade, describing the ending in terms of simple, quiet fulfillment, observing that Walt's purpose had been fulfilled, and that he simply stopped, as though the story had reached a natural conclusion, rather than an artificially constructed one. Other critics used similarly strong language, with one reviewer at IGN scoring the episode close to a perfect mark and describing it as fully satisfying, while another writer called it deeply satisfying and surprisingly emotional, a finale that managed to deliver closure without ever feeling manipulative or unearned. Not every voice joined in that chorus of approval, and the dissenting perspective that emerged proved just as influential to how the ending would be discussed and debated in the years that followed. Emily Nussbaum, writing for The New Yorker, offered one of the most pointed and widely referenced critiques of the finale, arguing that the episode wrapped up the entire series so neatly in Walt's favor that it read less like an honest conclusion and more like what she described as the dying fantasy of Walter White himself, rather than events that were actually happening within the story's own reality. Her theory suggested that the tidiness of the ending, Walt securing money for his son, eliminating his enemies, achieving a strange form of peace before dying on his own terms, felt too convenient to be trusted at face value, raising the possibility that some or all of it existed only in the dying imagination of a man freezing to death alone in that stolen Volvo back in New Hampshire. This particular theory gained enough traction among fans and critics that Gilligan himself eventually felt compelled to address it directly and put the question to rest. He confirmed unambiguously that the events of Felina were meant to be understood as entirely real within the world of the show, a position that received further confirmation years later when the sequel film El Camino continued directly from where the series finale left off, following Jesse's fate as an established continuation of events audiences had already witnessed, rather than treating anything about the ending as ambiguous or symbolic. Even setting aside the question of whether the events depicted were literally real, the deeper and more enduring debate around the finale concerned something more philosophical: the question of whether Walter White deserved the ending he received. On the surface, many of the specific outcomes could be read as a kind of victory. He avoids arrest and imprisonment entirely, dying instead on his own terms in the one place that had always made him feel most alive. He manages, through his elaborate scheme involving Badger and Skinny Pete, to secure a substantial portion of his remaining fortune for his son. He avenges Hank's death by killing the men responsible. He frees Jesse from captivity, even if that particular act arrives more from a change of heart in the moment than any long-held plan for redemption. And yet, looking closely at what Walt actually has left by the episode's final scenes, the picture of triumph becomes considerably more complicated. He dies utterly alone, having been physically removed from his own house by his wife and son in the previous episode, with his final in-person interaction with his son, consisting of Walter Jr. explicitly telling him over the phone that he wishes Walt would simply die and stop causing further harm to the family. Skyler, in their final conversation, remains visibly frightened of him, even as he tries to explain his true motivations for staying in the drug trade, delivering what amounts to the closest thing to an honest confession he offers anyone throughout the entire series, admitting plainly that he did it for himself, that he liked it, that he was good at it, and that doing it made him feel alive in a way nothing else in his life ever had. It is a moment of genuine self-awareness, arriving only once every other justification has been stripped away, and there is no longer any audience left to perform for, except Skyler herself. This tension between the tactical victories Walt achieves and the near-total isolation and moral ruin he is left with became the central axis around which most serious critical discussion of the finale revolved in the years following the show's conclusion. Writers examining the ending have frequently pointed out that Walt achieved something close to a complete tactical success while suffering what amounts to a complete moral defeat, managing to secure the practical outcomes he wanted while losing every relationship and every shred of the identity he had once claimed to be protecting. He gets to die as the version of himself he always secretly preferred, the brilliant, feared, respected Heisenberg, rather than as a withered, forgotten man, slowly succumbing to cancer in a hospital bed. And there is a real argument to be made that this, more than money or vengeance, was always the actual thing Walt had been chasing, beneath every other justification he offered along the way. Gilligan's own comments about the ending, given during and after the finale's broadcast, suggest that he understood the ending in exactly these layered terms, rather than as a simple happy or unhappy resolution. He described the conclusion at one point as feeling like kind of a victory for Walt, choosing his words carefully enough to acknowledge the genuine element of triumph in how the character's story concludes, while clearly avoiding any suggestion that the ending fully redeems or excuses him. In separate commentary, Gilligan drew a comparison to the long-running television comedy MASH, noting that his own show had begun with a man whose diagnosis meant he had only months left to live, and had ended, in a strange but consistent way, with that same man finally dying. The two endpoints of the story, fulfilling a kind of narrative promise that had been present from the very beginning, even if nobody watching the pilot could have predicted exactly how that promise would be fulfilled. Perhaps the most significant piece of context shaping how critics evaluated the finale involved comparing it directly to another landmark ending from the same golden age of prestige television, the deliberately ambiguous, abrupt conclusion of The Sopranos several years earlier. That ending, cutting to black in the middle of a family dinner scene without any clear resolution regarding the fate of its central anti-hero, had generated enormous controversy and debate, with many viewers feeling cheated by its refusal to offer any concrete closure. Gilligan has spoken about his own admiration for how David Chase chose to end that earlier series, while also being clear that his own approach to ending Breaking Bad reflected a different set of priorities entirely, one built around providing his audience with the kind of closure The Sopranos had deliberately withheld. He has framed this not as a criticism of Chase's choice, but simply as a reflection of his own instincts as a storyteller, wanting to give the audience who had invested years of attention into these characters a sense of genuine completion rather than lingering uncertainty. This distinction matters for understanding Breaking Bad's particular place within the broader landscape of prestige anti-hero television that flourished during this period, where some of its contemporaries chose ambiguity as a final statement, leaving audiences to argue indefinitely over unresolved questions. Breaking Bad closed nearly every open storyline with deliberate, almost exhaustive thoroughness. Nearly every character who had appeared with any significance across the show's run received some form of concluding beat, whether through direct appearance or through dialogue confirming their fate. Some critics found this thoroughness admirable, praising the discipline and control it demonstrated after 5 seasons of careful plotting. Others found it slightly too neat, arguing that the eagerness to tie up every loose end occasionally worked against the messier, more morally ambiguous tone the show had cultivated throughout most of its run. The numbers surrounding the finale's broadcast tell their own story about how completely the show's audience had grown by this point, a growth traced back to the streaming-driven expansion discussed earlier in this analysis. The finale drew slightly over 10 million live viewers, a staggering increase from the little over 1 million who had tuned in for the pilot back in January of 2008. That figure represented, at the time, one of the largest audiences ever recorded for a scripted cable drama finale, a remarkable achievement for a show that had spent its early years as a critically respected but modestly watched series, airing on a network still establishing its reputation for original programming. In the years since the finale aired, critical consensus around the ending has settled into something more measured and considered than the immediate, somewhat divided reactions that greeted it in real time. Later retrospective rankings of the show's individual episodes have consistently placed Felina among the strongest entries in the series, though rarely at the very top, with many critics and fans reserving that particular distinction for Ozymandias instead, viewing that earlier episode as the show's true emotional climax, with the actual finale functioning more as a carefully constructed epilogue, working through the practical and symbolic consequences of everything that had already been set irrevocably in motion 3 episodes earlier. This distinction between the emotional peak of the story and its formal conclusion has become one of the more common ways serious analysis of the show's final stretch tends to be framed, acknowledging that Breaking Bad's most devastating storytelling had already occurred by the time its literal ending arrived, and that the finale's job was less to shock the audience further and more to offer a considered, deliberate answer to the question the entire series had been asking from its very first episode. What does a good man actually deserve? Once he has spent years proving, one choice at a time, that he was never quite as good as he wanted everyone, including himself, to believe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Critics still argue over whether Walter White's ending counted as victory or defeat, and the show itself seemed to want the answer to be both at once. Next, the final chapter of this story, following what became of the show's legacy, its spin-offs, and the industry it helped completely reshape. Section 10. The Empire, Breaking Bad left behind. When Breaking Bad concluded in September of 2013, it left behind more than a finished story about a chemistry teacher and the empire he built and lost. It left behind a genuine shift in how television as a medium was made, marketed, watched, and evaluated by critics and audiences alike. A legacy that continued to expand for years after the final credits rolled on Felina, eventually growing into an entire extended universe of storytelling that few people could have predicted back when the show was struggling, simply to find a network willing to air it. The most direct extension of that legacy arrived in the form of Better Call Saul, a prequel series exploring the earlier life of Walter White's lawyer, Saul Goodman, before he adopted that name and that persona. Developed by Vince Gilligan alongside Peter Gould, a writer and producer who had been deeply involved with Breaking Bad throughout its original run, Better Call Saul premiered in 2015 and continued for 6 seasons, concluding in 2022. The series followed the character back when he still went by his given name, Jimmy McGill, tracing his transformation from a struggling, well-intentioned but ethically flexible attorney into the morally compromised figure audiences had already come to know from his appearances defending Walt and Jesse throughout Breaking Bad's original run. The show also brought back several other significant figures from the original series, including Giancarlo Esposito's Gus Fring, whose earlier history and rise to power received far more detailed exploration than the original show had ever provided, and Jonathan Banks as the world-weary, methodical fixer, Mike Ehrmantraut, a character whose own quiet moral complexity became one of the prequel's most celebrated additions to the broader story. Bob Odenkirk, who had originated the role of Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad's second season, spent years believing his character existed primarily as comic relief, a fast-talking, morally elastic attorney who provided levity amid the show's darker material. Building an entire 6-season series around that same character required Odenkirk to discover layers of vulnerability and genuine tragedy that the original show, focused so tightly on Walt's own arc, had never needed to explore in any depth. Critical reception to Better Call Saul proved remarkably strong throughout its run, with many critics and longtime fans of the original series arguing that the prequel matched, or, in certain respects, even exceeded the quality of the show that inspired it, a rare achievement for any spin-off attempting to live in the shadow of a genuinely landmark predecessor. The series developed its own distinct visual and narrative identity, built around a slower, more patient examination of moral compromise than even Breaking Bad had attempted, following characters whose transformations unfolded across years rather than months, and whose eventual fates audiences already understood in broad outline thanks to their prior appearances in the original series. That dramatic irony, watching characters make choices the audience already knows, will eventually lead toward specific, previously witnessed outcomes, became one of the defining structural pleasures of the prequel, distinguishing it meaningfully from simply retreading familiar ground. The series also introduced its own set of entirely new characters who never appeared in the original show at all, most notably Kim Wexler, Jimmy's partner and eventual wife, whose own arc across the 6 seasons became one of the prequel's most closely followed and emotionally significant threads, giving the extended universe a genuinely new center of gravity rather than functioning purely as connective tissue between established characters. Beyond Better Call Saul, the Breaking Bad universe expanded further through a feature-length film released directly to Netflix in October of 2019, titled El Camino, a Breaking Bad movie. The film picked up immediately following the events of the series finale, following Jesse Pinkman in the immediate aftermath of his escape from captivity, addressing questions about his fate that Gilligan had deliberately left unresolved in the original script for Felina. In fact, the finale's original penultimate page had described Jesse's departure in intentionally open-ended terms, with Gilligan writing that Jesse was heading toward something better, choosing to leave that phrase intentionally vague rather than specifying exactly what form that better future might take. 6 years later, El Camino provided a fuller answer to that question, following Jesse as he worked to evade the various parties still searching for him in the wake of his escape, while also processing the trauma of his months in captivity through a series of flashbacks weaving throughout the film's present-day narrative. Aaron Paul's performance in the film received strong critical praise, and the movie itself was largely seen as delivering a satisfying, if bittersweet, sense of closure for a character who had endured perhaps more suffering than anyone else across the entire franchise. The film also gave Paul the opportunity to work once again alongside several other actors reprising smaller roles from the original series, weaving a sense of continuity through the larger story, even as it focused tightly on Jesse's singular, exhausted perspective. The cumulative effect of this extended universe, spanning an original series, a prequel spanning 6 additional seasons, and a feature film, transformed Breaking Bad from a single acclaimed drama into something closer to a sustained creative project, spanning well over a decade, all originating from that single 9-word note Gilligan had scrawled on a forgotten notepad years before any of it existed. Few television creators have managed to build and sustain a fictional universe of comparable scope and consistent quality across such a long stretch of time, and the achievement stands as a significant part of why Gilligan's reputation within the television industry continued growing steadily in the years following Breaking Bad's original conclusion. That reputation followed him directly into his next major project, a science fiction drama for a different streaming platform entirely. One built around an entirely new premise, but carrying with it many of the same collaborators, the same patient pacing, and the same willingness to let a story unfold slowly, rather than rushing toward easy answers. Even audiences approaching that newer project with no connection to Breaking Bad found themselves warned, almost as a running joke within the television press, that this creator's shows tend to start slowly and demand patience before they reveal their full shape, a reputation earned directly from how deliberately Breaking Bad itself had once introduced its own bland, unassuming protagonist all those years earlier. Beyond its own direct sequels and spin-offs, Breaking Bad's influence rippled outward across the broader television landscape in ways that reshaped how networks and streaming platforms approached prestige drama moving forward. The show arrived during a period frequently described by critics as a golden age of television, a stretch running roughly from the late 1990s through the 2010s, during which dramas like The Sopranos, The Wire, and Mad Men had already begun demonstrating that television could achieve a level of narrative sophistication and visual ambition previously associated primarily with cinema. Breaking Bad built directly on that foundation, while pushing certain elements of the anti-hero drama formula further than its predecessors had, particularly in its willingness to let its central character travel an almost complete arc, from sympathetic protagonist to genuine antagonist, across the course of a single series, rather than settling into a more static moral ambiguity maintained across an entire run. That specific structural choice, a protagonist who begins as the story's hero and gradually becomes something closer to its villain, influenced a wave of subsequent dramas that followed in the years after Breaking Bad's success became undeniable. Series exploring similarly dark transformations, morally compromised protagonists, operating in criminal or otherwise ethically fraught worlds, proliferated across cable and streaming platforms throughout the 2010s, with critics frequently drawing direct comparisons back to Walter White whenever a new anti-hero arrived on screen. One frequently cited example, a Netflix original drama following a financial advisor drawn into laundering money for a drug cartel through a resort business in the Missouri Ozarks, drew such consistent comparisons to Breaking Bad throughout its own run that critics eventually began describing it as something close to a spiritual successor, built around a similarly restrained lead performance and a similarly patient, escalating structure of moral compromise. The specific combination Breaking Bad had perfected, patient character work grounded in genuine psychological consistency, paired with genuine consequences for every major choice a character made, became something of a template that other showrunners consciously or unconsciously worked from in the years that followed. Family-centered crime dramas that followed the show's success frequently borrowed its central emotional architecture. A domestic life gradually consumed and destroyed by a protagonist's secret criminal activity, even when the specific setting or subject matter differed considerably from cooking methamphetamine in the American Southwest. Perhaps just as significant as its influence on subsequent storytelling was the role Breaking Bad played in demonstrating the transformative power streaming platforms could have on a show's audience and cultural relevance. A phenomenon explored earlier in this analysis, but worth revisiting, Breaking Bad became one of the clearest and most frequently cited early examples of a series whose viewership on traditional cable broadcast grew directly as a result of exposure through Netflix streaming, establishing a pattern that countless other shows would go on to follow in the years afterward. Even well over a decade after the show's original premiere, it has continued to perform remarkably well on streaming platforms, appearing regularly among the most watched titles on Netflix during various measured periods, years after its original broadcast run concluded. A level of sustained relevance, highly unusual for any television series, regardless of its original critical reception. Data released by Netflix itself in the years following the show's conclusion has shown Breaking Bad consistently outperforming even its own celebrated spin-off in raw viewing hours, a testament to how strongly new audiences continue gravitating toward the original series as their entry point into this particular fictional world, even with an entire additional prequel series now available to explore first. The show's cultural footprint extended well beyond streaming charts and critical rankings, seeping into everyday life in ways few dramas ever manage. Its imagery became genuinely inescapable in the years following its conclusion, with images and lines of dialogue circulating endlessly online as some of the most widely recognized reference points in internet culture. Understood immediately, even by casual viewers who had never watched a single full episode. The city of Albuquerque itself, once simply the backdrop the production had chosen largely for practical and financial reasons, connected to local filming incentives, transformed into something close to a pilgrimage site for devoted fans, with local tour companies building entire businesses around driving visitors past specific filming locations, including the modest ranch-style house used as the exterior of the White family home, whose real-life owners eventually had to install a low fence specifically to discourage fans from throwing pizzas onto the roof in reference to a memorable scene from the show. The city leaned into this unexpected tourism boom, rather than resisting it, recognizing that a television show, largely responsible for putting Albuquerque on the cultural map in an entirely new way, represented an economic opportunity too significant to ignore. Award recognition for the series continued accumulating steadily throughout its run and reached its fullest expression during its final years on air. Bryan Cranston's performance earned him the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a drama series on 4 separate occasions, an achievement that placed him among an extremely small group of performers to win that particular award 3 years in a row, before eventually adding a 4th win for the show's concluding stretch of episodes. Aaron Paul collected 3 Emmy wins of his own for supporting actor across the show's run, vindicating in the clearest possible terms the decision to abandon the original plan to kill his character off after a single season. Anna Gunn added her own Emmy wins for supporting actress during the show's final years as well, recognition that arrived, notably, during the very same period when online hostility toward her character had reached its most intense and public pitch, an irony that several critics pointed out at the time, noting that industry voters and internet commenters seemed to be watching 2 entirely different performances. The series as a whole won the Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series twice during its concluding seasons, cementing its place among the most decorated dramas of its era. The show's academic and critical afterlife has proven just as durable as its award history. In the years following its conclusion, Breaking Bad became a frequent subject of university courses and scholarly analysis, examining everything from its use of color symbolism and chemistry as metaphor to its engagement with distinctly American myths of masculinity, capitalism, and self-invention. Critics and academics alike have continued returning to the show, specifically because of how densely it rewards close examination, finding new layers of meaning in details that seemed, on a first viewing, like simple pieces of production design or throwaway dialogue. This sustained scholarly interest, unusual for a show initially marketed and sold on the strength of its crime drama premise, speaks to just how carefully constructed the series actually was beneath its surface pleasures. A quality that has helped keep it part of ongoing conversations about television as an art form, rather than allowing it to fade into simple nostalgia, the way many once popular dramas eventually do. There was no moment where any of this looked certain. Breaking Bad started as a 9-word note scrawled on a forgotten notepad by 2 out-of-work writers worried about how they were going to pay their bills, and from there, it survived years of rejection from nearly every major network that heard the idea, a casting process that almost let both of the show's most essential performers slip away, and a slow, patient build that only found its enormous audience years after the first episode aired, thanks to a way of watching television nobody involved could have fully seen coming. The road that turned it into one of the most acclaimed dramas ever made was never guaranteed at any point along the way. It survived because one stubborn creator refused to give up on an idea almost everyone with the power to make it had already turned down. It succeeded because 2 actors found a chemistry that quietly reshaped the entire direction of the story unfolding around them. And it lasted long after the final episode, because the thing it was really about, a decent man's slow and deliberate transformation into someone unrecognizable, turned out to be exactly the kind of story people would keep finding, keep returning to, and keep pulling new meaning out of, for years after Walter White took his last breath among the machines of the empire he built.